أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين أبو القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Addam Allah ajurakum on these sacred nights of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this month's iCare seminar on the Ethics of Karbala with Professor Cyrus Ali Zargar, and we'll be beginning shortly. To open this seminar, though, can I request Brother Hassanein Juma to bless us with a recitation from the Holy Quran. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كلا بل لا تكرمون اليتيم ولا تحاضون على طعام المسكين وتأكلون التراث أكلا لما وتحبون المال حبا جما كلا إذا دكت الأرض دكا دكا وجاء ربك والملك صفا صفا وجيء يومئذ بجهنم يومئذ يتذكر الإنسان وأنى له الذكرى يقول يا ليتني قدمت لحياتي فيومئذ لا يعذب عذابه أحد ولا يوثق وثاقه أحد يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Ahsantum. Thank you so much for that beautiful recitation, Brother Hassanain. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, dear viewers, to the latest iCare seminar, which is very topical for this time of year. It is on the ethics of Karbala with Professor Cyrus Ali Zargar. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with iCare, perhaps this is your first time with us, the International Center for Advanced Islamic Research exists to bridge the gap between authentic Islamic scholarship and the community. And we do this in many ways. One is through seminars such as this, both online and in person, through conferences and through publications. And I invite you to visit our website for more details of the kind of programs we run. And before we get on to the main event and I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to talk to you about a few things. So for those of you who are based in the UK and especially in London, we have an event on the 3rd of August with Dr. Hawra Al-Hassan, who will be joining us for a live in-person seminar at the iCare offices in Harefield, where she will be discussing Shahida Bint al-Huda and her novels. So if you would like to join us for that, there are limited spaces available. So please follow the link on your screen and also found in the comments below to icare.ac/seminar. And you can reserve your spot. Spaces are filling up already. So if you are interested in joining us, please do go and register via our Eventbrite. So that will be happening on the 3rd of August at 6 p.m. And we will be serving dinner with that as well. And it promises to be an excellent seminar, so don't miss out. Also, I'd just like to call attention to the fact that at the moment, WF-Aid is running the Ali Asghar Water Appeal 2024. And if you'd like to contribute to this excellent initiative in making sure that clean, drinkable, safe water is available in some of the most deprived regions of the world, please scan the QR code or follow the link. And every little helps. So whatever you're able to contribute would be most excellent. So please do. If you have a minute, just follow the link or scan the QR code, and even if it's just a pound or $1 or more, that can really help WF-Aid continue their excellent work in Africa and beyond. Finally, I just want to invite you all as well, if you are joining us for the first time, to make sure that you're following us on all of our social medias. So we are on all of the major social networks, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Of course, you know about YouTube because you are watching through YouTube, and Telegram. You can follow our Linktree link here, or scan the QR code and you'll be able to follow us there. That is the best way to keep up to date with all of our latest events and news and initiatives. And there's going to be quite a lot of stuff happening over the next few weeks and months. So please do give us a follow. Now I'd like to turn to today's presentation, which is on the ethics of Karbala with Professor Cyrus Ali Zargar. Now, for those of you who don't know, Professor Zargar is the Al-Ghazali Distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies and Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida. And his research interests include the metaphysical, aesthetic, literary, and ethical dimensions of Islam's spiritual traditions. And so we are very pleased to have him here today with us. He's done a lot of excellent work. Professor Zargar, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it, especially with the time difference. You know, I think it's morning over there for you.
Well, it's not. Yeah, it's 10, 12. Yeah, it's not too bad. People on the West Coast who are listening are really,
they're the real heroes.
Yeah, they're the real heroes. Yeah.
But we're really glad to have you with us, and just give us a brief introduction to what you're talking about today.
Well, earlier this month, my book, The Ethics of Karbala, came out with Routledge, and essentially, I'll be presenting a few key ideas from that book. The book is a response to the modern condition, thinking about how the narrative of Karbala and its remembrance can be thought of as a sort of healing. It's been a long time in the work. I've been working on it. I've been working on it for quite a bit, and I'm happy to now share it with others.
Yeah, we're thrilled that you're going to be sharing it with us today, and I think it's a really sort of timely publication. It's come out at the right time of year for most people to benefit from this. And I think what really interests me when I sort of looked at the blurb you provide, and I've been sort of flicking through the contents page, is the fact that you're looking at not just the story of Imam Hussein, which we're all familiar with, but what that story means. What kind of values is that story trying to call on its audience to embody? And I'm really excited to hear what you're going to share with us today. But I just want to point out that this you've been working on this for a long time, but this isn't actually your first book, is it? You've written several books, including some that have come out quite recently.
That's right. Yeah, actually, earlier in July, my other book with the State University of New York Press came out. The book on Attar, Religion of Love. And that's why I was working on this for a long time, because I always had to sort of juggle other projects. This was something that was just an interest of mine, that on my own, sort of at the end of the week, I would do. But yes, yeah, the Attar book is another one that came out earlier this month, and before that, there were two other books.
And what were those?
So my first book, 2011, Sufi Aesthetics, was a study of Ibn al-Arabi and Fakhruddin Iraqi, and it's as the title would suggest, it was a study. It was a consideration of their theories of beauty, and applied to how do you read their poetry through their theories of beauty. My second book was 2017, 2018, The Polished Mirror. And that's 10 chapters where I go through different different Muslim thinkers on ethics, on virtue ethics. The first half is falsafa, and the second philosophy, and the second half is Sufism.
And of course, storytelling plays quite a big role in that research as well, right?
It does, exactly. Yeah, good observation. Yes, as it does here. Yeah,
as does here. Yeah, so
yeah.
I'm seeing sort of a common thread.
Yeah.
Through your research, sort of a focus on how storytelling can be used as a way of conveying a message about virtue and morals and and metaphysical realities. And I think that's something that's often overlooked, in academic discourses on Islam. My own research, I look at popular sermons, and again, sort of this is often neglected in favor of more technical and abstract works on jurisprudence and philosophy. But actually, for the overwhelming majority of people, things like sermons and storytelling were how they would receive the message of Islam and the message of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, and I feel like I should get out of the way now and let you enlighten us with these points from your book. So thank you again for joining us, Professor Zargar. And just so you know, just before I let you begin, I just want to make the audience aware that while Professor Zargar is talking, there is the comment section on YouTube that is open for your questions. So if you do have any burning questions that pop into your mind while Professor Zargar is talking, please feel free to share it in the comments. It will be open from now until the end of the seminar, and we will try to get as many of your questions as possible to Professor Zargar to answer. So if there's something you want to hear more about, something you want clarifying, or an idea that pops into your head you'd like to get Professor Zargar's perspective on, please do drop it in the comments, and we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A after Professor Zargar's talk. So without further ado, can I ask everyone to recite in their from the comfort of their own laptops and mobile devices aloud salawat for the health of Professor Zargar. Salawat.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. This is a virtue ethics approach to narratives on Karbala. I think to most of us, to say that there is a deeply ethical dimension to the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, his family, his companions at Karbala, is to indicate the obvious. Worldwide, most Muslims interested in the narrative have found it to be a perfect example of the distinction between those motivated by power, greed, and fear versus those motivated by love, loyalty, and honesty. So that dimension of my argument is something that we probably don't need to discuss too much, especially considering our audience. But to make two other claims about Karbala might take us more time. It might get us a bit more mired in detail. The first of those claims is that the events at Karbala illuminate our modern situation. And I say that with an awareness of my position as someone who grew up in the United States in the 21st century, someone who grew up and lived through decades of wars, multiple wars, but didn't really witness any of them firsthand. Nor did those wars affect my own life or well-being, and that's true for most Americans. Like most Americans, I have had the privilege of being completely sheltered. And for those in my position, Karbala might help us have a picture of the value of the traditional warrior in a setting where now war seems to be always present, but then the traditional warrior is mostly absent. And I'll come back to this, however briefly, later. The second thing, the second issue that Karbala helps us understand and appreciate is the way that moral reasoning might have worked in early Islam. We're often thought to think technically about issues, whereas it's relatively clear to me that the Imam and his companions were thinking in terms of virtues. They were thinking about who they are and the expectations that exist for who they are, rather than thinking about, let's say, a categorical imperative, ethical calculus, or some sort of universal or revealed law, or anything like that. If that's the case, then maybe Karbala can help us implement moral reasoning in our lives in a way that is more holistic, organic, in a way that's more human than what we see in our current paradigms. So with that in mind, I'll begin with an inscription, and it's described in the Maqtal al-Hussein of the Hanafi scholar from the 12th century, 6th century Hijri, Al-Muwaffaq ibn Ahmad al-Khwarizmi. He reports that it was inscribed upon the sword of Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, the following: the stingy one is ever blameworthy, al-bakhil madhmum. The covetous one is ever deprived, wal-haris mahrum. And the envious one is ever afflicted, wal-hasud maghmum. In other words, if you suffer from stinginess, if you suffer from covetousness, if you suffer from envy, those vices put you in a constant state of either blame, feelings of deprivation, or feelings of sorrow. And this is said to be kana maktuban ala sayf al-Hussein, that is, inscribed upon the sword of Imam Hussein. Now, let's set aside whether this is historically accurate or not. That actually doesn't matter. And one of the things that I like to do in the book is to think about the message that the writer of the Maqtal, or the recorder of history, is trying to get across. Because if you were to take all the different accounts together, I mean, it might not add up. Not all of it can be historically true at the same time. if there's any kind of discrepancy, but all of it can be thematically true at the same time, especially when there are consistencies, and there are. And there's always a reason why something has been recorded in the way that it's been recorded. And you'll find over and over again with the story of Karbala, this emphasis on ethical perfection. What you're seeing here in what Al-Khwarizmi describes is that the message of Imam Hussein is a message that corresponds to a virtue in the book that I translate as nobility, namely karam. Karam is a comprehensive virtue, and that's how it's described by these writers. It encapsulates all of the virtues that are possible for a human being to have in an early Arabian Islamic context, the context in which Imam Hussein lived. I say Arabian Islamic because, yes, Islam emphasizes karam, but of course, before the Quran, karam had these meanings as well. A person who has karam is obviously not stingy. In fact, one can translate the possessor of karam, who's called the karim, as a generous one. Though I would say that it's the kind of generosity exuded and displayed by a noble person. It's a function of nobility, in that such generosity is precipitated by nobility. And in that, the noble person can be identified by never being stingy. Nor is the noble person covetous, because of their contentment with what they have, their satisfaction with the state of things. And the noble person, who must be aware of his or her own nobility, wouldn't be envious of others. After all, why would someone who's noble and has a high status envy others? Either those other people have the same status and can thus support the noble person in his or her aims, or they should aspire to be like that noble person. They're, in other words, someone that noble person has to pull up to their level. The karam embodied by Imam Hussein and expressed on the plains of Karbala is actually the driving factor in so many of the things that the Imam does. And in that way, it might even be the central or core message of the Karbala narrative. Now, that's something to think about and talk about, because obviously what we call taqwa, God-wariness, is incredibly central as well. But one has to think, is taqwa a function of karam, or is karam a function of taqwa? It's a discussion to have. In a way, you could see taqwa being a function of karam because it shows the nobility of that person in observing the proper relationship with God, the ultimate source of goodness, the ultimate source of beauty. But this is something we can talk about later. But going back to the inscription on the sword of Imam Hussein, you'll see there's a kind of happiness or felicity that comes from being free from these vices. The person who has the vices that are written on the sword is unhappy and ultimately not free. They're bound by their own desires, whereas a person who has nobility and therefore doesn't have these blameworthy traits, you see how they're free from them, right? They're uninhibited. In fact, one interesting phenomenon about the Karbala narrative, or Karbala narratives in general, is how often the word free comes up in them. Imam Hussein challenges his enemies toward the end of what happens on the day of Ashura. He senses that there's a threat to his camp after his death, a threat to the women and the children. And so he says to them famously, "Woe unto you, if you have no religion and you do not fear the day of the return, then at least in your worldly affairs be free men of noble traits. فَكُونُوا فِي أَمْرِ دُنْيَاكُمْ أَحْرَارًا ذَوِي أَحْسَابٍ." Safeguard my camp and my family from the cruel and dissolute among you. In other words, if you're not driven by piety, taqwa, by the fear of the day of judgment, then at least be free men. Be good, noble Arabs. Behave, at the very least, like those Arabian warriors who, even before Islam, understood that these actions are inappropriate, attacking women and children and not protecting them. Behave as though you come from good families. Behave as though you're part of a moral elite, even if you've lost your religious zeal, your devotion to God, and your fear of betraying God's messenger, the Prophet Muhammad. Here and elsewhere, the word freedom, so here, ahraran, free men, it comes up over and over again. So we see it to describe Imam Hussein's brother, Al-Abbas. And of course, in a beautiful touch of irony, we see it in the case of a man named Al-Hur. He's named the free one. The irony is that he's named Al-Hur, the free one, but he's caught between two worlds. His allegiance to Ibn Ziyad and the enemies to Imam Hussein on one hand, and his awareness that this purported criminal, Imam Hussein, is actually the son of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, in whom he believes. So he's not free. His name is free, but he's not free. It's only when he finally makes that choice that Imam Hussein declares him as being free, just as his mother named him. This freedom, then, is a moral freedom. It's a freedom from vices, but it also refers to a person who is noble and of good birth. I should just mention here that such use of the word free applies in a much larger context. You can see it in the Greco-Roman world. When we say, for example, the liberal arts, what we mean are those arts or those sciences that wealthier, noble, free people could study because they weren't bound by the sort of manual jobs comprised by what's called the technical arts. This idea of a free person is common to the Mediterranean, Western Asia, and it describes a noble class of people distinct from those who are enslaved, were once enslaved, or might be called commoners. Now, from an American egalitarian perspective, it's difficult to appreciate such traditional virtue systems where there are these elites who are meant to be imitated by others, elites who function as models for the rest of society. But I would say, American egalitarian prejudices aside, it also doesn't really describe the situation in early Islam, which even then was, in many ways, an egalitarian religion. The Quran and the Hadith often tried to elevate everyone to a standard met by elites who are elite, not because of their wealth, but because of their moral goodness. Their nobility has an otherworldly quality to it. And of course, those moral elites are the Prophet and his family. So when we compare the two camps in the narrative of Karbala, on the one hand, we have Imam Hussein and his followers who are associated with karam, or nobility. And on the other hand, we have those who are not free. They're bound by improper allegiances, but they also aren't behaving according to the more general standards of nobility that they know to exist. There's more than that, though. And this is something that I explore in the book. Another issue is that Imam Hussein and his camp follow an older model of what it means to be a warrior than what is starting to appear in the camp of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and, by extension, Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Think about it. Imam Hussein's camp in Karbala is a small group of people, let's say 72 or so soldiers, accompanied by their wives and children. In their model of warfare, their leader is present on the battlefield with them. Imam Hussein is there. He watches them go out. He's present among them. And he's going to engage in combat after being defended by them. And I have to add here, because a certain historian misunderstood the fact that Imam Hussein remains until all of the other soldiers go before him. This follows the traditional model of warfare where the honor of the soldiers lies in protecting their chief for the entire time that he's present. So these warriors who fight for Imam Hussein do so because their allegiance is to him. And it's to him because of who he is. He is thoroughly a noble person. He belongs to the moral elite. He is someone worthy of defending, worthy of one's loyalty, and he is there. He's present. Now look at the other camp. What you begin to see is that creeping into Islamic history is the imperial model of warfare, which is very different. In the imperial model of warfare, the moral leader is absent. So Ibn Ziyad is not there. He's not present on the battlefield. He's the governor of Kufa, which is where he stays. Even more than that, the ultimate commander of all of this, Yazid, the caliph, he's even more absent. He's further away. He's in Damascus. And the soldiers who fight aren't really motivated by anything moral in their leader. They're motivated by wealth. And they say this themselves. There are accounts, such as the account of that detestable soul Sinan ibn Anas, who murdered Imam Hussein and declares himself, "Weigh down my mount with silver and with gold, for I murdered the king, the best of humanity, best in terms of both mother and father." So in other words, he's very aware that monetary reward, and in the case of some others, fear of retribution, has created this sense of obedience, but obedience to whom? To absent leaders. And as I point out in the book, this creates a very different kind of warfare than what you see on Imam Hussein's side. For Imam Hussein's followers, the driving factor in their efforts is often love and mercy. The quintessential warrior in Imam Hussein's camp is his brother Al-Abbas. Now look at who Abbas is. He's a loving brother. He's a caring uncle. And the main mission in the narratives is when he goes out to bring water back for the children. And upon his return, he loses his limbs. He's surrounded. He's outnumbered. But consider what the narratives tell us very often about what's going on in his mind. His thoughts are said to be focused on the disappointment of those children, the thirst of those children, and the thirst of his brother. It's love, it's care, it's compassion. There's something fatherly or even motherly about the actions that the soldiers take. Those soldiers also find solace in the fact that their chief is there. He appreciates their actions, their sacrifice, and their loyalty. So there's a direct connection. On the other hand, the quintessential symbol of the imposing imperial camp for me is the famous archer Harmala. We might call him a sharpshooter, actually. He shoots from a distance, and he's not really involved in the action that he undertakes. There's no risk to himself in what he does. And what he does, he doesn't do out of love or care for anyone. It's an act of obedience that stems, again, from either fear of retribution or hope for worldly reward. But an important part of the entire situation on the battlefield for Harmala and his ilk is that there isn't even room for mercy or love. So in Harmala's most famous act of murder, when he shoots an arrow through the neck of Imam Hussein's infant, the accounts tell us that the compassion of the imperial army had been aroused. But one issue that existed was in that short time frame, no one could obtain approval from Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad to make an exception and have mercy on this baby. There isn't room for that kind of thinking. There isn't room for that kind of mercy. The order has already been made, and the person who made the order isn't there. So it's being carried out, one might say, robotically. So this brings me to my first conclusion, the one I had mentioned before about modern life and about the kind of moral reasoning that we do. I'll mention it here quickly, and perhaps it's something that we can discuss in the question and answer portion, because a brief discussion wouldn't really do it justice, and I haven't really gotten into the details of this part of the argument. I'll allude to it. To an extent, the manner in which we live is more conducive to that robotic type of decision making than to the interpersonal and traditional kind of life that Imam Hussein and his supporters adopted. Moreover, the warfare that we see around the world today is more robotic than anyone could have imagined. A cold, calculated, mitigated by level upon level of absent decision makers, a sort of way of doing things. And that means that there's less room for mercy. And there's no room for what I call the warrior ethos, the noble warrior that we see in these traditional contexts. And that's both East and West. I didn't get into it here, but my interest in the narrative of Karbala is to think about other traditional warrior narratives that are like it. There wasn't room in the book to do that. The book is a very short book. But I think that would be the extension of the book, would be to think about other such narratives. So this is so tied up with the structures of modern life, this, let's call it robotic sort of way of decision-making, that the only hint of reprieve that I see is in the remembrance of something that doesn't exist perfectly for us. And that would be in the commemoration of warriors, such as Hussein and Abbas, by commemorating them, reliving in an empathic way the events of that time. Then by means of our remembrance, we keep those virtues alive. Now, in terms of moral reasoning, I want to point out two things, both of which comprise the second conclusion that I'm getting to, my final conclusion. First, that the way that Imam Hussein seems to make decisions and declare his decisions often have to do with who he is, his stature as a moral exemplar, and what befits that stature, what suits that stature, much more than what we would call some sort of universal rule-based or technical approach. So, for example, we know that at a certain point, Imam Hussein and his soldiers were about to be cornered by Al-Hur, I mentioned earlier. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, the Imam's supporter, brings up the option of attacking early, at that point, before they're completely cornered in Karbala and they have no chance of victory. He basically suggests, let's attack now against Al-Hur and his army, and this would give Imam Hussein and his army a chance. Strategically, what Zuhair says makes sense, but Imam Hussein refuses. And he says, I will not be the first to fight. Now, for reasons that you'll soon appreciate, I read this as saying, it is not befitting for me to be the first to fight. To understand what I mean, let's go back to a much earlier declaration, one made before the events in Iraq took place. The governor of Medina, a man named Walid ibn Utbah, tried to place pressure on Imam Hussein to give his allegiance to Yazid. Let's consider the language of what Imam Hussein says in response. أيها الأمير إن أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة ومختلف الملائكة وبنا فتح الله وبنا ختم الله ويزيد رجل فاسق شارب الخمر قاتل النفس المحرمة معلن بالفسق ليس له هذه المنزلة ومثلي لا يبيع مثله. Let me translate. O governor, we are the household of prophecy and the treasure trove of divine messengership. We're the location of the coming and going of angels. Through us, God began it all. Through us, God has sealed it all. Yazid, however, he's a transgressing man. He's an imbiber of wine, a killer of the forbidden soul, in other words, a murderer, overt in his transgressions. This status, هذه المنزلة, does not belong to him. And one like me, مثلي, does not pledge allegiance to one like him, مثله. First, he describes who he is. Imam Hussein. He says, this is who I am. And how does he describe who he is? He places himself as part of the quintessential moral elites of God's religion. Then he describes who Yazid is. And in that language, what we see is that he and his family, Imam Hussein and his family, are the standards to follow, and Yazid is not observing that standard. The Imam Hussein and his family, they're the beginning to an end, to what we can decide is right and wrong. They're the opening and they're the closing. In other words, we could say they're the mean. They're the moral mean. They're the definition of moral uprightness. Yazid, on the other hand, is someone who has gone beyond the mean. He's transgressed. He's a fasiq. Fasiq meaning he's a transgressor. He's overridden it. He's overreached it. He's sharibul khamr. So this doesn't merely indicate that he's a sinner. Look at the sin. Look at the sin that Imam Hussein he's chosen, right? It indicates that Yazid obeys his passions. In obeying those passions, he doesn't make wise decisions. This leads him to become an unjust person. And, as Imam Hussein says, a murderer of the innocent. He does these things openly and brazenly, which means that he doesn't see them as evil. Yazid doesn't recognize the very standards of nobility and noble action that were confirmed by the Quran. This renders him unworthy for the rank that he proclaims, the rank of the leader of the Muslim community. But when we get to the core of what Imam Hussein is saying, he says, someone like me does not give allegiance to someone like him. Someone like me. That's important. What it means is that tied to Imam Hussein is much more than a kind of cause and effect analysis of what will happen based on any pledge of allegiance that he might give. This isn't some sort of calculation. There are certain things that befit the moral exemplar, and there are certain things that just cannot be expected of someone who has that status. This is something that cannot be done. And I think that when it comes to starting the fighting, that's a similar type of decision. And we see this decision, this kind of decision making over and over again at Karbala. It's something that I cannot do. It's not within me to do that. It's not that the person lives by a code, because if we say a person lives by a code, we imply a series of rules that a person must always follow. That puts the code in the elevated position. But in this model, the person is in the elevated position. The person, their qualities. After all, God has divine names, and the moral person, the godly person, has noble qualities. Those noble qualities determine at any instance what that person senses, intuits, or knows that they can or cannot do, should or shouldn't do. And I see the followers of Imam Hussein as having learned that from him when they give everything and are willing to give everything on the day of Ashura. When his soldiers, his sons, his nephews, his brothers are willing to give absolutely everything to support him, what they're really ultimately doing is saying, in me, you can see a reflection of his nobility. Look at me, and you will see him. That's a very different matter from someone abstracting rules that can be applied whenever there's conflict or warfare. It's different because the exemplar must be known, or in this case, be there. You have to know him. You have to see him. You have to learn from him. This is, by the way, why things proceed so naturally for Imam Hussein's sister Zainab. She has seen him. She has seen their brother Hassan, their father Ali, and their mother Fatima Zahra. This is why the transition between brother and sister is so fluid. Why the thematic connections are so constant and strong between what happens before and after the murder of Imam Hussein at Karbala. She assumes his position once he's martyred. She's able to do what he would do in that situation because of the mirroring that happens when you focus on a person's virtuous quality, learn from them in that way. So I hope some of this has been helpful, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zargar, for that beautiful presentation. I think in that 25 minutes, you touched on so many points that we can explore. So I'm just going to remind everyone now to use the Q&A panel in YouTube, and you can submit your questions for Professor Zargar there. Anything that comes to mind, or anything that you would like to sort of hear more about, that's what this is a great opportunity to do that. Just before we move to the Q&A section, I'd just like to remind everyone about our upcoming seminar in London. For those of you who are based in the UK, and especially based in and around London, we're being joined on the 3rd of August at 6 p.m. at Harefield. So that's the eye care office at Harefield, by Dr. Hawra Al-Hassan, who will be delivering a seminar on Shahida Bint al-Huda and her novels. So Shahida Bint al-Huda, as many of you will know, is the sister of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and she is, she as well as, out of her many scholarly achievements, she is very well known actually as an author of Arabic novels. So if that's something that interests you, please do go to icare.ac/seminar and sign up. There are limited spaces, so if you would like to come along, dinner will be served. Sign up through our Eventbrite. I think there've already been quite a few sign-ups already, and that's before most of our advertising has gone live. So it's well worth signing up now. If you'd like to come along on the 3rd of August. Once again, I'd just like to remind everyone about WF-AID's Ali Asghar water appeal as well. This is an incredibly important and beneficial humanitarian project that WF-AID is running, runs every year. And if you're able to give any amount, no matter how small, please scan the QR code on the slide on your screen now, or go to the link donate.wf/AAWA Ali Asghar Water Appeal, and please give generously. Finally, I would also like to remind you all, if you're not doing this already, please do give us a follow on our socials. We're on all the major social networks. So without further ado, now I'd like to open up the Q&A. I'll go first. Actually, I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about the title of the book, because you use the word myth in there, and I'd like you to sort of elaborate on that a bit further, because most of the time when we hear the word myth in everyday discourse today, people assume that myth means something that is not factual or not historical, and I don't think that's what you're trying to suggest by the use of that. So can you explain why you've got the word myth in the title of your book?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I'm glad you asked, actually. Basically, first of all, the events at Karbala, the Battle of Karbala, is, as you know, Sheikh Alex, is one of the best recorded, in fact, it is the best recorded, as far as I know, event in early Islamic history. I mean, it's without a doubt. So it's not a myth in that way. We're sure that it happened. And in fact, we have a lot of detail about it as a historical event. But in the study of religion, when a narrative takes on communal importance, it becomes expressed ritually, it becomes valued in a certain way, it comes to define a community, then the shorthand term for that kind of sacred narrative is myth. And it helps us because it helps us place Karbala within the framework of other sacred narratives, other narratives that bring group cohesion, which is where it belongs. You wouldn't study Karbala, let's say, like history of battles. Let's study Karbala and let's study some battle from World War I, right? You wouldn't do that. Because the battle from World War I, we're mostly interested in numbers, things that happen. It doesn't have that sacredness to it. You would study Karbala, the Battle of Karbala, where you might study, battles from the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, or battles from the Hebrew Bible, or battles from Indian philosophy, Hinduism, that talk about a great figure. In these, there's a commonality in that there's more going on there than just the historical events.
So it's almost then. I mean, because I think this is something that often gets missed in when we talk about history today, because there is obviously there's obviously a big concern with what really happened. So, for example, there are debates about how many soldiers were there in the army of Yazid. Was it 7,000? Was it 30,000? Was it 100,000? How many people did Imam Hussein alayhi salam actually kill? Was there actually when was the water actually cut off? And how, for example, there are differing narratives with some of the family members and some of the companions, describing that how did they actually die. But from what I'm hearing you say is almost that these sorts of questions, while valid, miss the point of the story, which is more than an agglomeration of facts and historical accounts, and is actually almost so when we say it's a myth, we mean it's more than history. It's not that it's not historical. It's actually, in this sense, it's more than history, because there is a message attached to this history. There is there is a moral for us to take from it, and that's, in a way, that is equally important, if not more important. I mean, that's the whole purpose of these events taking place, to give us that message. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm exactly. There are I've seen books, lectures where speakers are sort of sensitive to the historicity of events, and I understand that. I appreciate that. But on the other hand, if you look at even elements of the narrative in some accounts that might not have been historically true, you can still ask the question, why are they there? And what do they tell us? And what does the community get from that? As a whole, though, in the book, I have a chapter that discusses this. I actually think the historicity and the historical factualness of this narrative is an important part of it. That it's you could say a kind of balance. It's a balance between the narrative being true historically, but not being bound by history. That being true historically, but pointing to and indicating something beyond history, which I call the ahistorical. I'm borrowing that from Nietzsche.
So then, I suppose then, if we're talking about historicity and sort of historical accounts, I think it's really interesting. You pointed out that the Battle of Karbala is actually one of the most well-attested events, if not the most well-attested event in early Islamic history. There are numerous eyewitness accounts. It was something that people were desperately interested in from the earliest days, in understanding quite literally what had happened. What had happened at Karbala. How did we end up with so many members of the Prophet's family? In fact, the Prophet's own grandson, being killed so brutally. I mean, people. I mean, when this event happened, it sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, to the point where there was an outcry in there was an outcry in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. When word reached Damascus, even, this is according to some accounts, this is one of the factors that led to Yazid releasing the Prophet's family, that there was such a moral outrage even in the Umayyad capital of Damascus at what had been perpetrated. This is very well attested. But I think what's really interesting is you sort of said there's a balance. I would go further than that. I would say this is possibly one of the most powerful. I mean, we have so many attestations from different historians and thinkers who've come across this history. Whether it's Gandhi, or the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. People sort of come across this and say, you can't ignore this story. This is such a powerful narrative. But on top of that, as well as being this incredible narrative, it's also completely true. This also happened. This isn't a legendary account. This isn't the Shahnameh or the labors of Hercules, or even biblical accounts the life of Jesus, for example. It's none of these things. This is a historical event. This is something that happened, that was recorded by eyewitnesses. So it's absolutely true, and it has this powerful message. So it's this fantastic story with this powerful message, and it also happens to be quite literally true. Not true just in the sense of, well, it's true in its meaning. It's true in the morals it's giving us, in the way we might talk about, a moral fable, like some of those that you talk about in your work on Sufi virtue and storytelling. But this has a real moral to it. But at the same time, it's a completely factual event that took place. And I think there is almost, the hyper rationalism of the modern world, because we've seen this, right? Sort of the general skepticism with which religion is viewed leads to this poverty of historicity, where we're so focused on pinning down the exact details to the point where we'll get into arguments about whether it was 10,000 or 30,000 soldiers. And in doing so, perhaps we miss the fact that, well, actually, that's not the most important detail we should be taking from this. So I appreciate your intervention there. Related to that, though, kind of what you were saying about your reading of the Karbala narrative, how would you locate that in relation to, shall we say, the more traditional readings of the narrative, the older Shi'i tradition?
Well, this goes back to the title. When I say the ethics of Karbala, I'm thinking of something very specific. I'm thinking of the study of ethics being related to the word ethos, being related to virtues. And so I think if my book does anything, what I hope it does is take the narrative of Karbala and place it within a context where it can be discussed in university courses on virtue ethics. It can be discussed by those who, let's say, aren't Muslim. They're not. How shall we say? They're not committed to this story in some sort of personal, devotional way, but they can still appreciate why this story and stories like it matter ethically. So that's what I'm hoping the book this does. The book does that those other very important endeavors don't do. The story definitely does matter. It does matter in the story that Imam Hussein is the grandson of God's messenger. And in the Shi'i context, it matters that he is the Imam, the representative of God on earth, right? But actually, the narrative still functions in this very beautiful way if you don't embrace either of those two things. Not in its fullest way, not in the way that it would it does for many during this month when they commemorate it, but in another way. It's worthy of study, in other words. So I'm hoping that's what the book gets across.
Absolutely, and I think that's so. One of the questions which I'll take from the YouTube stream now, and rephrase slightly to fit in with what we were just talking about, is that quite often the rituals surrounding the commemorations of Muharram and Ashura and the sacrifice of Imam Hussein and his family and companions alayhim salam at Karbala, to people who aren't part of the Shi'i tradition, it can be difficult to understand, even for other Muslims. Although I'd just like to note that traditionally, for hundreds of years in the Islamic world, it was very common for Sunnis to commemorate Imam Hussein right up to the modern, and many still do. Incidentally, it's just something that has been suppressed in recent years but this is something that Sunnis also recognize. But I think even for our Sunni brothers and sisters, it can sometimes be difficult to understand what's going on. But then for non-Muslims now, going even further afield, for non-Muslims, it can be utterly incomprehensible. And sometimes I think almost more harmfully, it can be exoticized and orientalized in the way we sort of see that the focus on the ritual, the rituals of mourning, while overlooking the message. I mean, I think I've lost count of the number of documentaries on the history of Islam that when they talk about Sunnism and Shiism, they mention, Karbala as if the Sunnis were on the other side of this, and that this is the origin of the split. It's like, no, Sunnis and Shias are both firmly in the camp of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, when it comes to this. But I think for outsiders, they sort of see, they see Shia mourners dressed in black, they see the alams, they see the latmiya, they see the crying and the strong emotions, but that message doesn't necessarily come through. And I think one of the challenges in the West, and this is something that I remember has been going on for at least 2 decades, for at least 20, for as long as I can remember. There have been efforts to sort of to make the message of Imam Hussein accessible to non-Muslims or to people who aren't Shias. And we've seen campaigns. So, for example, everyone's heard of Who is Hussein? So, they distribute leaflets and organize campaigns sort of around Muharram and Ashura time, so that, to explain what's going on. There have been other, examples too. There was a very famous documentary that was done in the early 2000s by Red Tears Productions. So there have been lots of attempts to sort of present Muharram in a way that is more that is more accessible to others. I was wondering, like, from your perspective, and I feel that your book as well could be seen as fitting, fitting within this. And I know that there are some other initiatives going on, especially in North America, sort of, I think at Harvard as well, as there is there's been a program this year on Muharram and Imam Hussein. So I would sort of situate your book almost as an intervention in this tradition, in this sort of current within modern Shiism, which is to try and make this message of Imam Hussein universally accessible. But I'd love to hear, what are your thoughts on this? How do we build on what you've identified here, which is this universal message that anyone can access? And I want to sort of throw in a flip side there. How do we avoid this just becoming watered down to something that is simply, a liberal platitude, which we've seen. So, for example, with there's a very good book on sort of the commercialization of spirituality. I think it's called Buying Buddha and Selling Rumi. And the idea that sort of you can take these great spiritual traditions, strip them of everything that makes them unique, and reduce them to something that's essentially, feel good and therapeutic. Like, so how do we make the message of Imam Hussein accessible to people of other faiths or no faith at all, based on human values, without somehow reducing that message?
Well, that's a great question. One thing I would suggest, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier, Sheikh Alex, about those who, let's say, the remembrance of Imam Hussein used to be part of their cultural traditions and now is not, right? Well, what is that person very often thinking? What they're thinking is that there's a circle of things that they'll call Islamic, and this falls outside of this circle. It just doesn't look right, right? And we can all suffer from that, where we create a circle, and in this circle is what we think is Islam, of being Islamic, and or being good, or being allowed, or being proper, and everything outside of that is not. And I think one of the things that we should all be doing is kind of looking at that circle and seeing how justified it is. Can it be expanded? Can things be included that aren't? And that includes Shi'i Muslims too, I'll give you an example, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But I saw this once where a group wanted to undertake a march. And it was a march for commemorating Imam Hussein through a certain city, downtown. I won't mention which city. It doesn't matter. An English-speaking city. Let's put it that way. Where most of the residents spoke English. That's what matters. So they took this march downtown, but very little of what they did was in English. And there were people there who were willing to recite poetry in English. There were people there who were willing to do a lot of things in English, where this marching downtown wouldn't have looked like people wearing black who are angry about something or sad about something. They came and they left, and we have no idea what happened, right? And maybe in some imaginary world, what you're hoping is someone will say, oh my gosh, what is that? And come ask you about that. Well, sure, but why not just tell them, like why create these barriers where they have to come and beg you to understand what you're saying, right? I mean, the Quran was revealed in Arabic, it says, so that the audience would understand it. It seemed to me that maybe like that would be something where the circle can be expanded. Expand that circle. It might not feel right for people who are commemorating Imam Hussein to have a lot of poetry in English. A lot of the centers, they say, oh, it doesn't hit me right. It's like emotionally, right? If I hear it in language X, Y, or Z, it means something. This English stuff is not. And so if they do it, they might like, here's the 5 to 7 year old children. They're going to come up and recite a poem in English because that's who the English language is for. Well, if the message is important, you might want to consider expanding the circle, right? If you're living in an English-speaking country, majority English-speaking country, similarly, if you're in a place where there's English and Spanish speakers, maybe have something in Spanish too. We get caught in these circles too. Everyone does, where what's right and normal is this. Well, be open-minded. That would be one thing. This has nothing to do with the book. This has to do with me and my experiences and just sharing. But that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very valid point you made, and it's quite interesting how you took that. And you said we need to expand those circles, and I wasn't expecting you to sort of mean language by that, but I think that's very true. That we sort of think that the commemoration of Imam Hussein has to be done in a certain way, in a certain format, and we forget, of course, that there was a time. Although when I think about the main languages that we commemorate Imam Hussein alayhi salam in now, aside from English, it's Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Of course, we forget that there was a time when no one was commemorating Imam Hussein in Urdu, and there was a time when no one was commemorating Imam Hussein in Farsi. And I can almost hear the howls and objections of some of my Iranian brothers to that. But there was a time when this was something that was taking place primarily in Arabic, and then over time, we had it started to happen in Persian, and then over time it started to happen in Urdu and other local languages. There had to be a process of translation, and that's actually how Shiism spread. That's how the message of Imam Hussein spread, because people would have heard the story and wanted to know more. And I think that's true. I think that's not just true about Imam Hussein alayhi salam. I think it's true about the teachings of all the Ahlul Bayt and the teachings of Islam as a whole, that this all took place through people translating their experiences to a new language, and we need to be open to doing that too. So I think that's a really valuable contribution.
Yeah.
Now the next, I think I want to shift gears now and take another question from our audience. So I think there's a really good question here on how do you think the Imam's ethics impressed people outside his family who joined him on the journey, and some who actually, some like Hur, for example, who literally only joined him in the last hours. How can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Definitely, yeah. Because this comes up in the book, so that's it's very easy for me to respond to. So, one key example you mentioned, the person asking the question, a great question, by the way, mentions Al-Hur. Hur is such a beautiful case of this, because what Imam Hussein does in the narrative, in his meeting, is he can be rough with Al-Hur because he's trying to wake him up, in the narrative. But at the same time, he shows Al-Hur, and he shows that side of the camp, this caring, loving approach that I've been talking about. Famously, he provides water to the enemy at this point when they meet. But of particular importance for me is one episode where there's a man there who he is so thirsty that he's kind of fumbling with the water skin. He can't drink it. And Imam Hussein not only helps him, there's a point where the man doesn't really understand what Imam Hussein is saying because of the language barrier. And Imam Hussein is very gentle with him and careful with him. And he gives him water and gives the horse water. I think that gentleness, that love, that care, that compassion, right? That brings people to come and approach the world that way, And that's the only way you can understand the story of Imam Hussein, right? That's the only way you can understand what was happening at Karbala. And that's the only reason, that's the only way that Al-Hur wakes up. He wakes up, I mean, of course, he realizes who Imam Hussein is. He knew that from the beginning, but he's thinking about it now. But he also sees the character, and he sees the beauty of this man, right? So I think that's an important part. Of course, you know, anyone will tell you that ethical perfection is very difficult to happen in a short amount of time. So there's always something that you have to look into someone's past to see why they have become what they've become, right? You can see people transform quickly, but there's always a chain of other events behind it in their life that you'd have to know about to see that development.
And of course, for every Hur, there is not only an Umar ibn Sa'd, there's, thousands of other people who simply followed orders, who did as they were told. And I think that's, that's the striking thing about the example of, Hur and the few others who switched sides. I mean, they were, it's evident that it was Imam Hussein's moral character, and just the fact that this man was so evidently a living saint, for want of a better word, that he was, just the epitome of goodness. And it made them deeply uncomfortable that anyone would wish to do him harm, that there could be any justification for harming such a person. And I think, the contrast is always drawn where, Imam Hussein alayhi salam gives water to the, to Hur and his soldiers when they meet. But then Hur becomes very uncomfortable with the fact that Umar ibn Sa'd and his soldiers are then preventing Imam Hussein from getting water. And we sort of see this, by the way, this isn't just with Imam Hussein, and we see this, with the Prophet, salawatullahi alayhi, and we see this also with Imam Ali. So, at the Battle of Siffin, for example, when Imam Ali's forces controlled access to the river, they allowed the soldiers of Muawiyah to come and obtain fresh water. But then when Muawiyah's soldiers took control of the river, they refused to do the same. And then when Imam Ali took back the river again, again, they allowed Muawiyah's soldiers to access it. So I think there is this, you're right, there is this sort of this ethical character at work. It's not just a code, as you know. I'd like us to come back to that, actually, if you permit me, because I'd love to hear more. Because if I understood what you were saying, it's the idea that noble character begets noble actions, and you explicitly held that up in contrast to the idea of there being a moral code that someone has to to follow. So could you elaborate a bit more on that? Like, how does sort of this idea of nobility of character producing noble actions? It's almost as if you're saying that not that there are no rules, but that this isn't an ethical system that's dictated by following rules. It's something that comes from within the Imam themselves, and indeed from within his followers. So it almost goes, again, if we can sort of parallel between history and myth, it goes beyond the rules to just goodness flowing out of the person, even when there are no rules to follow, even when there isn't a rule to follow.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing the right thing time after time because you're following rules and not because it somehow emanates from who you are, then I think you have to ask yourself the question, have you really, who are you? Are you really a decent person? Are you really a noble person or not? I mean, look, have you ever, I'm sure you have, Sheikh, you've seen the case made, believe it or not, for the side of Yazid. And if you look at the case made, it's that, well, he was the caliph of the time, and you should obey the caliph of the time. And what people will often do when they want to counter this argument that Imam Hussein should have obeyed the caliph of the time, so he was in the wrong. It's like, they'll get into this whole long, let's go back to Ghadir Khum. Okay, hold on, time out. Do you need to go that far? Do you need to prove that Imam Hussein was, let's say, the Imam of his time to prove that what Yazid did was wrong? No. How do we know that? By the plethora, the large number, the mounds upon mounds of Sunni authors who not only agree with Imam Hussein on this issue, but commemorate him. I think most of the accounts of Imam Hussein that I use in the book are from Sunni authors, by the way. Not just today, but in general. And not because I'm trying to make a point, but just because it's really good history writing. And you'll find really no difference between Sunni writers and Shi'i writers when it comes to the Maqatil on these issues. It's a historical event, and they agree with him. I'm saying, why? Not because they say, oh, he was the living Imam from the Shi'i theological perspective, but because they're able to see big picture Islam. And that's what I think the supporters of Imam Hussein did. That's what I think was happening on that day. That's what Al-Hur is a soldier, right? And the soldier has a way of looking at things. And in a soldier's life and in a soldier's mind, you obey the command and so on and so forth. But to be able to step back and see what's really happening and to see the big picture, right? See who this man is, see what he stands for, see what the enemy wants and what the enemy stands for. I think that's at the heart of the message there, right? And that kind of big picture thinking, that kind of taking everything into account is, we might call it, a kind of wisdom that comes from, manifesting the virtues in your life. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something, again, going back to the fact that the sacrifice of Imam Hussein is something so there's been traditionally commemorated by Sunni authors. I mean, we forget that some of the most beautiful poetry written in Persian about Imam Hussein actually, in fact, came from authors who were nominally Sunni. I mean, there's the famous couplet. I think it's from Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi. Dinast Hussein. Hussein is the religion. It's like and he says that he gave his head before he would give his hand to the tyrant Yazid. And I think that's that's something that we can focus on. And I think that the explanation you gave there of why Imam Hussein's message resonates beyond the confines of Shiism, but to all Muslims, and I think indeed to all fair-minded people who come across this story, is that it's the fact that this is just so obvious. This is so obviously not just a righteous person, but a good person, a kind person, a person who has done nothing wrong to anyone and is simply standing up for what is right at a time when no one else will. I mean, I don't need to tell you, Umar ibn Sa'ad isn't a nobody. He's the son of the famous hadith narrator Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. Abdullah ibn Umar was alive at this time, one of the most prominent early hadith scholars, and he just sort of sat this one out. He didn't, he didn't get involved. And so this was a time when really sort of many of the best and brightest of the Islamic world were sort of sitting quietly while Yazid took the Pledge of Allegiance. And, bearing in mind this Pledge of Allegiance was one taken at the point of swords. And Imam Hussein really was the only person saying, this isn't okay, and I'm not going to endorse this by pledging allegiance. And he's quite explicit about that as well. I mean, you mentioned him trying to avoid conflict. Not only does he refuse to strike the first blow or fire the first arrow, he's at every moment he's offering sort of ways out of a battle. He's saying, look, if you've changed your minds, he says to the army, you are the ones who wrote letters to me. If you've changed your mind, I'll go home. And, if that's not okay, well, then I'll leave the lands of Islam. I'll go and live somewhere else.
Let me go to India. That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one. Yeah, he says. I mean, that was fascinating when I read that. Yeah. I
mean, I was going to say if you've read the I don't speak Urdu myself, but having read the Urdu poems, the translations of the Urdu poems, sort of written in honor of Imam Hussein, you can kind of understand why he wanted to go to India. He must have known that some of his most devoted followers would be there. And then he says, okay, and if that doesn't work, if you're not happy with that, then I'll talk to Yazid myself. Let's go. We'll resolve this between ourselves. But I'm not pledging allegiance here today to this man. And of course, it's Umar ibn Sa'ad and Shimr and the army of Yazid who are saying, well, no, you're not leaving here alive unless you pledge allegiance. Whereas Imam Hussein is the one who's trying to avoid conflict. Let's take another question from our audience though. And this is a really interesting one. Someone has asked, is freedom an ethic or a trait? Can you expand more on the state of freedom upheld by Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his family and companions and the lessons we can draw from them?
That's a very good question too. I didn't think about the question of whether it's what we call like a virtue or a more general trait. But we could definitely say that it's a way to describe the Karim, the noble person, right? And in a lot of these texts, it's also a synonym for the noble person. So,
and that's why as well. Just to interrupt.
Yeah.
Why Imam Hussein alayhi salam, his last words to Hur before Hur expires is, "You are as your mother named you, free in this world and free in the next." This idea of it's very poetic. That Hur basically lived up to his name.
Yes,
the free man.
Exactly, 100%. Yes. But that's, I get into this again with this contrast between Al-Abbas and Harmala at the end of chapter 3. What does it mean to be free as a warrior, right? The camp of Imam Hussein, you could say they never compromise on their principles, but you can also say they are always authentic to themselves. This is who I am. And they say it so often. Look at me. This is who I am. This is my lineage. This is my imam. Take it or leave it. You want to kill me? Kill me. But this is who I am, right? On the other side, you don't see that kind of freedom, right? It's hierarchy. It's order. It's fear. It's suppression. And it's fascinating to me that we could tie that to being ignoble, right? That we could say, you're not free. You're acting like an enslaved person here. Mentally enslaved. You're not mentally free. You're not psychologically, emotionally free right now, right? When you can't give water to a baby, right? You're not free. But we can tie that to a vice. We can say you are not. That is different from being noble. So I think that's to me. It's a fascinating way of looking at the events of Karbala, right? Because the narrative calls you to a kind of freedom, right? And that's why I mentioned in the beginning what was said to be inscribed on the sword of Imam Hussein. Because being free can be in the smallest things. If you're bound by envy, if you're bound by covetousness, if you're bound by, these are smaller ways of not being free in your life.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Small ways of not being free in your life. And I think as well, if we do look at the narrative, as you said, it's always Shimr who's telling the soldiers, who's kind of goading it's like, the number of times you see Shimr in the narratives basically yelling at Umar ibn Sa'd's troops to get on and do their jobs. It's clear that the majority of the army don't want to be there. They don't really want to be fighting Imam Hussein, but they simply lack the nobility and therefore the freedom to do otherwise. And Shimr is the one who's yelling at them, like, you've pledged allegiance, follow your orders, do as you're told. And you never see Imam Hussein telling his. In fact, you see the opposite from Imam Hussein. On the eve of Karbala, he's the one telling his followers, like, look, they're going to kill me. You don't all have to die here. You should all leave. He's trying to avoid getting all of his followers killed, for his sake. And his followers, and isn't it beautiful though that his followers are literally free to go, as in no one would stop them leaving. Imam Hussein wouldn't blame them for leaving, and yet they choose to stay. And doesn't that just exemplify this idea of the nobility and freedom that you've so beautifully kind of laid out for us?
And on a social historical level, while we might see this as something specific to Imam Hussein and his followers, on a social historical level, I think it points to a different model of warfare than what's starting to emerge. Let's not forget that the Islamic imperial expansion for the most part, happens on the backs of not just beyond after paid soldiers, enslaved soldiers. People aren't aware of this. If you listen even to a lot of sort of Islamophobic pundits and things like that, well, they'll talk about jihad as having something to do with Islamic expansion. Actually, very few of the campaigns of Islamic expansion were formally declared as something jihad or anything like that. They were mostly either paid or then, for the most part, enslaved soldiers. Your average Muslim was kind of, not involved, right? What does that say? This is a different model than the original model that the Prophet Muhammad and Imam Hussein had, where your loyalty is to the person as a moral exemplar, right? And by the way, who really discusses this beautifully is Ibn Khaldun. He does a wonderful, wonderful discussion of this shift in Muslim society. So,
yeah, that's right. That he does look at that shift away from the early Islamic virtues to sort of this institutionalized
precisely.
Almost in a way, I think was it Durkheim who spoke about the shift away from charismatic authority to sort of formalistic legal authority, right?
Weber, yeah.
Weber, sorry, yeah, not Durkheim, Weber. That's right, yeah. And so Ibn Khaldun got there first, though, with his But I think though when we look at the story of Imam Hussein, for example, you mentioned the quote, the likes of me, mithli, does not give allegiance to the likes of Yazid, mithlu. It's almost as if, and you use the term model, but I would maybe take it a step further. I would say we're almost dealing with something that is archetypal here, that this is being, these figures are, even though these are historical figures and these are historical events, I mean, this is one of those cases where, it's almost, this is an event, these are events of cosmic significance, because they represent not just two diametrically opposed models, but two diametrically opposed archetypes of what it is to be a human being. On the one hand, you have, the free human, the noble human represented by Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his followers. And then on the other hand, you have, fear and control and authority and tyranny and the ignoble human, the enslaved human. And by the way, I think it's really important when we say enslaved, like in the case of the soldiers of Umar ibn Sa'd and the soldiers of Yazid, they were voluntarily enslaved. They allowed themselves to be enslaved. That they were also there by choice, but they convinced themselves that they didn't have a choice. They allowed themselves to be almost, to be told that you have to do this, whether you like it or not. You have to follow orders. But I wonder off the back of that, because obviously the Umayyad Caliphate is no more. Yazid is no more. Well, I mean, it's not that he's no more, and I hope that wherever he is, he's suffering terribly. But he's no longer in this world. But what then is the relevance? Now, obviously, it's very easy to map, to map the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam onto contemporary events. But what I want to ask is, though, that in terms of our day-to-day lives, because there are obviously geopolitical events going on now where the similarities are undeniable. The fact that these archetypal forces are at work in the world. But I'm more interested in terms of our everyday lives. If there was one way in which we could be more like Imam Hussein when we're making, because people forget that, as you said, you sort of mentioned this with Hur, that in order to see why it was Hur that changed, you sort of have to almost have this genealogy, this moral and spiritual genealogy of his life. I think people often imagine that, everyone talks about, sort of Imam Hussein and Karbala and Ashura, and everyone thinks that sometimes making that moral choice means that you have to be in this epic battle between good and evil, and it's, and that's what being virtuous is, that's what being moral is. And I think we overlook, you said this, because you said the small ways in which we are not free. Can you talk about, would you be comfortable speaking about some of the small ways in which we can be more free as individuals, be more moral as individuals and be more like Imam Hussein as individuals?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. But I mean, in essence, a lot of it isn't new, right? So much of what leads a person to being morally free, noble, it's not going to surprise anyone. Loyalty, honesty, right? And you think about the opposites of that are on the sword, right? Envy, covetousness, a lot of it. But then what happens is that with a kind of consistency in practice, in times of great conflict or pressure or stress, in times when a person can do right or do wrong, suddenly everything that you've been practicing, everything that's been kind of a part of who you are, becomes much more important. It escalates. That's what makes war so significant. It's not that war is a good thing. War is horrible. It's not that we're by talking about warriors, we're hoping that there will always be war. War should end now. There should never be war ever again, right? But the reason why we focus on wars is because wars are moments of heightened significance in the course of human events, where the decisions that we make become more important, the sacrifices we make become more extreme. The people that we hurt are more hurt than they would be in under normal circumstances. So I'll give you an example of a way in which sort of short-term changes sometimes don't last. It's kind of a funny story, but I'll say it. A friend of mine went to the Hajj, and he went from America, and he was telling me about the people that were with him because there were some of them who they had been putting off the Hajj for like decades, and they weren't really practicing Muslims. But what amazed him was when they were at the Kaaba and they saw the Kaaba, their tears were streaming from their eyes. He said he described them like angels, and he said they had this sudden change while they were there. But what struck him even more was that on the bus on the ride back, they were driving to Jeddah, and the bus had taken off in the middle of the night or late in the night, close to the early morning, so that they were going to have to drive right through Fajr prayer. And this friend of mine starts to protest. He tells the bus driver, "Listen, just pull over. I have to pray Fajr. Please just pull over for 1 minute." And those same people that he had seen crying and angelic and all that were like, "No, just keep going." And one of them said to him, "The Hajj is over," right? So what I mean by that is, I don't mean to put anybody down or anything, but what I mean to say is that there are sudden transformations a person can make, but the kind that last and the kind that are meaningful usually have to do with what's built on over a long, long period of time, right? That's what's amazing about the story of Karbala, is that if you go into each of those people, and their lives have been recorded quite well, and there's books, there's entire books that they'll tell you each chapter will be on one of the companions of Imam Hussein, right? And you look at it, there's always more to the story than what happened in the days preceding Karbala. There's always more to the story when you look into the person's life, and it's not what you expect. So someone could have been not with the camp of Imam Ali before these events, ideologically opposed, but there's something in that person's life that made them stand with Imam Hussein at the very end, right? And you have to figure out what it was. You can't just say, "Oh, it was this moment," because if it's this moment, it's not that meaningful. You have to look at what was being built.
That beautifully put. And I think also, we see examples of other people in their, in their lives as well. They're surrounded by good people. Like, I'm trying to think, was it Zuhair ibn al-Qayn who when he met Imam Hussein on the way, and he was traveling with his wife, and he was sort of mulling this over at whether he should join Imam Hussein.
He was trying to avoid him.
He was trying to avoid him, and then in the end, he was sort of, yeah, that's right. He was trying to avoid him, and then eventually they ended up at the same rest station, despite Zuhair's best laid plans to get out of, being, I sort of think of Zuhair bin al-Qayn as a bit like Han Solo, this reluctant, heroic figure, who's sort of trying, because he knows what he's going to do if Imam Hussein speaks to him. And then, I love the fact that sort of Imam Hussein sends word for him to, come sit down, I need to talk to you. And Zuhair is sort of like, he doesn't want to go. And it's his wife who actually turns to him and says, the grandson of the Prophet just asked you to go and talk to him, go and see what he wants, And I think, I feel that there's so much we get wrong about our view of ethics and heroism and virtue in the modern world, because we sort of have this very individualistic view of it. And I think, there's an element of sometimes it's also being a virtuous person means surrounding yourself with virtuous people. It's like, you sort of see on, you have all these Instagram videos about success and like you have to surround yourself with successful people. Well, that's true. You have to surround, but then how do you define success? And if we're defining success as fundamentally being a good person, then we should be surrounding ourselves with people who want us to be good too, and who we want, it's sort of mutually supporting. And so I think we see that sort of in cases of Zuhair bin al-Qayn and others, where they're not just individual heroes. There is a whole community of people around them, or a network of people around them, or a circle of people around them that promotes their virtue, whether it's their spouses, whether it's their children, their parents, their friends. And I think that's something that's I think that's something that's beautiful in those stories as well. So we're very short on time, and I feel like you and I, Professor Zargar, we could go on all day. So I want to get one or two final questions from the audience. So this is quite an interesting one. Like, what is your view on Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam going into the water and taking the water in his hand and then as if to speak to the water directly, rather than simply stopping at the edge of the bank, because there is this, there is the famous account where Hazrat Abbas sort of almost plunges into the river and is portrayed sometimes as being on the verge of drinking, but then saying, no, I won't drink. And we actually have a similar one of, Imam Hussein, when he's, portrayed as being on the verge of drinking, then someone says, oh, you're going to drink water while your family are thirsty. And then he throws the water away. Like, how are we to understand these narratives? Like, what is the message here?
I think one of the fascinating things about that account is, much of what I've studied before I studied before I wrote this book was Sufism. If you go to Sufi texts, you'll see that there's this idea that love undoes all arguments, right? That love can basically, everything you know and understand about the world, love can devastate it, right? Now, if you look at, what Al-Abbas is doing at that moment, right? I mean, there wouldn't be anything wrong with drinking the water. I mean, you could even make an argument that it would make him better able to come back, or stronger, or there are all kinds of rational arguments you can make. But in the domain of love, right? How could he? How could he, knowing that they're thirsty and that Imam Hussein's thirsty? That's what I mean. There's a kind of I think a way to read this narrative, and people have. It's something new, where they're reading it through like Sufi poetry. If you've noticed, very often people will read a few baits from Maulana Rumi or Hafez in the Persian tradition before they read about Imam Hussein, showing you that this connection between being sort of losing oneself in love is the way to understand this narrative. Now, unfortunately, in my book, I could only touch on that because you can only do so many things. But I was very impressed by the writings of Muhammad Iqbal. I mean, Iqbal really, really takes this issue, and he does it from the perspective of Sufism. He really gets into the narrative of Imam Hussein from the perspective of love in a very analytical, beautiful way, by the way. If anybody wants to look at it, I mean, it's good.
Wow, that's quite a recommendation. I think that's a lovely way of looking at it as well, like seeing this as a story. I mean, there is so much love in the story of Imam Hussein. There's tragedy as well, but that tragedy is that, I mean, we forget that tragedy, the tragedy and the grief that exists because the primary feeling there is one of love and loyalty. I mean, when Imam Hussein's companions on the eve of Ashura, proclaim to him, even after he's told them to sort of depart and to seek safety, that they'd rather be, cut to pieces and brought back and cut to pieces and brought back and cut to pieces and brought back before they, and they still wouldn't leave, no matter how many times they went through that. I mean, if that isn't love, I don't know. I don't know what to call it. I don't know what love is if not that. That sort of that utter devotion that we see from Imam Hussein's family and followers towards him, that even when presented with a way out, it just makes them want to stay more. It almost as if it confirms to them that they were right to love this man in the first place. That he's because he's given them that. Because anyone else would say, yeah, I need to keep my followers around me. I need protection. I'm vulnerable here. But Imam Hussein is sort of telling him, it's like, go. They want me. They don't want any of you. And that almost confirms in their mind that they were right to love, because that's the act of a truly noble person. Final question, and we must end. So, the murder of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is obviously very painful for us. And it seems that this murder, his sacrifice was inevitable, given the fact that he was refusing to pledge allegiance to Yazid. But then the question arises, the capture and imprisonment and maltreatment of the women and children of the Prophet's household, could that not have been avoided by sending them back with Hazrat Abbas, for example, alayhi salam, and some helpers? Like, why do you think? And both in terms of history, but also in terms of the story, why does it make sense that the women and children had to go into captivity? Why did they have to go through that hardship?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, it's a question that's probably best answered by historians of Karbala, and they exist. Some really careful historians who you can even see maps where they'll show you what took place, where it took place in great detail. And those would be the people you'd want to ask that kind of question to. And I'm ashamed to say I'm not one of them. I just had this kind of, approach through moral philosophy that I was thinking of it. But it would seem to me that probably whoever wasn't killed would have also been taken captive. It seems to me they didn't have the resources for the journey back. So it's not like you can just go, you have to have the resources with you to go back. But they had been cornered and kept there for so long that they didn't have those kinds of resources for someone to come and take them, and nor would they have been allowed to. I think that it seems to me that Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad's purpose was humiliation. So he wouldn't have, let's say, let someone take the camp back and left that person without having his army go out and, stop them. He wanted to parade them through Kufa. That was a part of what he wanted to do. Of course, as we know historically, that did not end well for him at all. He wasn't prepared for the Alawi rhetoric of Zainab, as Tahir Qutbuddin has beautifully, by the way, discussed. Highly recommend. She's really gotten into Zainab's rhetorical skills, right? Amazing. So he wasn't what's that?
To the point where Ibn Ziyad even said that, you speak like your father.
Precisely, yeah. And the fact that we have a study in English of that is amazing. So he wasn't prepared for that. Now, maybe if you want to look at it from a divine wisdom perspective, this was all a part of some great divine plan. I don't get into that kind of thing. But I just doesn't seem like it would have been possible. And let me also, I want to respond to one of the things as we're ending right now. I just want to respond to one of the things that you were saying before about love. And this gets to what the book does, right? My book presents Karbala ethically, but I hope no one walks away with that with a sense of me saying that that's what other people should be doing, that the way Majalis is held is that the whole purpose of Karbala was just to teach us ethics. So let's cease this emotive side of what we do No, actually, Professor Hassan Ali, he really, he and I had a wonderful conversation about this, and he reminded me as well how important the emotive part of this is. And suffice it to say, and I'll end on this, that I can't remember where Allama Tabatabai says this, but Allama Tabatabai says that two things open up your eyes in the spiritual realm. He says this, reading the Quran and remembrance of Karbala and Imam Hussein. Now, obviously, that's not something that I can study and put in this book, right? That doesn't mean but that doesn't mean that we should somehow that invalidates it. I mean, that in fact means that there's so many dimensions to this narrative that we shouldn't limit it and say that it is either this or that. It's this and that. It's the emotional part, which links to the spiritual part. It's the ethical part, right? It's all of these things at once, and I don't think we should deprive the narrative of any of these just because we're studying one. I just wanted to make that clear so that there wasn't any confusion.
No, I think that's a really important point, that just because we're studying a figure or a narrative or a doctrine from one perspective, that doesn't mean that we're invalidating all of the other perspectives, on that, or meaning that we're saying that this is the only way to look at it. And I think that's a perfect. I was going to ask you if you had any final thoughts, but I think that does it beautifully. And thank you so much. No, thank you so much for that. It's been a genuine pleasure having you with us, Professor Zargar, and thank you for sharing, a few snippets from your book. I would encourage everyone to go out and get a copy. I think it's available now through most booksellers now online, and it would be wonderful actually if we could have you back when you do your next book as well, which I'm sure given how many books that you've published in recent years, I can't imagine that would be too long.
God knows, but I do need to thank you for having me and giving me time to talk about something that's very important to me, something I've spent time working on, and to share these ideas with others, for having this platform, and really for engaging with the ideas in such depth. So thank you, Sheikh Alex, and to the rest of those that I care, I am grateful. There's a note here about where people can get the book.
Yes,
everywhere. Amazon. It's published by Routledge, the Routledge website, but the online, the booksellers, they all have it. Also, look, the book at this point is kind of pricey. Don't underestimate libraries. I mean, just if you just want to read it, there's all kinds of places you can get it.
So support your public library.
Yeah. University libraries for sure should have it soon. It might take a few months, but they'll have it. This is later.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And final question from me: what now? What are you going to be working on in the future?
Well, I'm going back to Sufism. Really, I've been working on a book which I haven't defined it yet, but I'm very involved right now in thinking about dreams and dreaming from a Sufi perspective. Now, I don't know where that's going to go, because the first part of this project had to do with the Quran and thinking about the language of the Quran from the perspective of theoretical Sufism. The book is yet undefined, but it will probably be somewhat of an introduction to Islam through key ideas from what I would call theoretical Sufism. So I wish I could define it further, but even I don't know what it is yet.
Perhaps it will come to you. Perhaps it will be revealed to you in a dream.
That would be great, but I doubt it.
That'd be great.
Yeah, maybe. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper. I just kind of go to sleep and wake up. That's
that sounds delightful. But thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me
and sharing your research with us, and giving so generously of your time and answering our questions. I think I speak from everyone here when I say that we've learned so much from having you with us today, Professor Zargar, and we can't wait to be back again in future. Actually, for those of you who want more of Professor Zargar's talks. He also delivered a really good paper at the conference. So if you look on our YouTube channel, I think it was in the first session of the first day. So it will be panel number 1 on our YouTube channel. You can find his, you can find his talk there, where he spoke about Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam and embodied knowledge. And I think that was definitely one of the highlights of the conference from me. And I'm not just saying because you're here with us. I'll say that behind your back as well.
Appreciate it.
So just to wrap up now, I just want to thank thank you, Professor Zargar, once again. I also want to thank the fantastic team here at the International Center for Advanced Islamic Research, Ali Mehdi Nanjiani and Zainab Hassan, who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes. So all of this beautiful sort of control work they're doing in terms of putting everyone on the on the screen and making sure everything's running, getting stuff out on social media, organizing this, planning timings, making sure everything's set up so that we can have this seminar. That's all down to them. I also want to thank the fantastic Marcoms team at WF, Sabra Juma, Fatima Ali, and Fatima Sohrapana and everyone else on the team for all their hard work in terms of producing the advertising, the graphics, and just giving us advice on how to get the word out about these events. And I also want to take a moment to thank everyone else at WF for all the support we receive in doing this work, bringing this to you. But most of all, I want to thank everyone who's joined us today in the audience. It's been great having you here. And I also want to just run through some quick announcements now. So one more time, I want to remind those of you who are in or around London or in the UK and feel like coming down, that we have an event on the 3rd of August, which is with Dr. Haura Al-Hassan, which we'll see a slide for in a minute. I also want to let you know that, yes, there we go. So she will be talking on the 3rd of August about Bint al-Huda and her novels, Shahida Bint al-Huda and her novels. And that promises to be really interesting, and spaces are filling up. I believe we've had quite a few signups in the course of this seminar. So please do go and reserve your spot. It's completely free, but we need, we only have so many tickets, and there will be dinner served as well. So there will be food for both mind and body at this seminar on the 3rd of August. Next, I would just like to ask all of you who've attended today, and those of you who are watching, to share your feedback with us. Sorry, I'm currently causing complete anarchy with the iCare team by talking about these slides out of order. Please give us your feedback about the event. So you can scan this QR code here or go to icare.ac/feedback. We would really like to know what you thought of the event. What do you feel went really well? What would you like to see more of? And also, what do you feel could be improved on? How can we make these events more engaging? Is there anything we missed? Do we need more special effects? Would you have liked even more time with Professor Cyrus? All of these are valid feedback. It's really important to us, and it actually helps us improve our programs and deliver more content like this and different content as well to you. So please do give us your feedback. I've already mentioned the Dr. Haura seminar on the 3rd of August. I'd also like to call your attention to, if you are interested in Islamic research, and would like to kind of find out what sort of research we're undertaking, I'd like to recommend to you the Al-Qalam journal, so a journal of advanced Islamic research that's published by ICAR. 2 issues are out already, and a 3rd issue will be released in a couple of months, actually. So it's a biannual journal, 2 issues released every year. Issues 1 and 2 are already out. You can get it on Amazon in both print and ebook formats. And if you're interested in Islamic research, then this is a great place to learn more. It's got articles and book reviews as well as relevant news in there. So pick up your copy today. Once again, I'd like to also call everyone's attention to the Ali Asghar Water Appeal 2024, which is ongoing at the moment. It's a fantastic appeal run by WF Aid, making sure that people in some of the most deprived parts of the world have access to clean, safe drinking water. So please give generously, give whatever you can. So you can follow the link, donate.wf/AAWA, or you can scan the QR code. No amount is too small, to help with this project. It's very worthwhile, and I'd encourage everyone to give, especially, given the time of year that we're at, the stories that we've just heard, the story of Ali Asghar alayhi salam and the suffering he went through. I think a world in which every child has access to clean drinking water is a world that we want to live in. It's a world that we want to build. So please do give generously. Finally, just another reminder: do follow us on socials. We're on all the major networks. Whether it's Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, or Telegram. Just to point out as well, everything I've said so far in terms of whether it's the feedback, the Dr. Hawra, signing up for the Dr. Hawra seminar, the journals, the Ali Asghar Water Appeal, following us on socials, all of these links are in the description to this video. So if you aren't quick enough to scan the QR code, by all means do go down to the video description. I erroneously said comments before, but go down to the description and you'll find the links there. Give us a follow on social media. It's a great way to keep up to date with everything we're doing, and to get the latest news and the latest outputs from us. So you can find all of the links on Linktree /iCare_AC, or you can scan the QR code, or links in descriptions. Finally, I would just like to say, if you enjoyed the seminar and you want to see more seminars like this, and you want to support us in our work, you can also donate directly to iCare via the WF Donate platform. So if you scan this QR code, or you go to donate.wf/iCare, that's ICAIR. Again, no amount is too small, and we're always very grateful for any donations we receive, as we are ultimately supported by the WF, which is a charity. And we really value the fact that a lot of our audience members do chip in even a small amount to help us cover the costs of seminars such as this one. And if you do value the work we're doing, please consider becoming a supporter. So finally, I would just like to say once again, thank you very much to Professor Cyrus Ali Zargar, who's the distinguished Al-Ghazali Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Central Florida. Thank you to you guys, the audience. Thank you to the whole team, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. And we ask that you remember us in your du'as, and we pray that you will make the most of the blessings of these sacred nights between now and Arba'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.